Between 1960 and 1965, several things happened in Nigeria, of course, starting with the independence. But that's what we know about history, about Nigeria in the annals of history. There are certain things that happened that have come to shape the future, that have come to become responsible for all the problems that we see in Nigeria today. Many things. Somehow these things elude us because what we are about to focus on today has always been done to Nigeria without us knowing. What is it that was done? After independence in 1960, and between 1960 and 1965, there was a wave across Africa, a nationalist wave. And of course, it was the era of independence. It also happened to be the era of the Cold War between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, or what you refer to in short as the Soviet Union, which is modern day Russia. There was a Cold War. We need to put emphasis. I need you to focus on the term Cold War. See, Cold War is horrible. It is better for there to be a hot war than for there to be a Cold War. Hot war, we know the First World War, the Second World War, they were hot wars. So we know who is fighting who, we know who is throwing bombs to where and all that. But in the Cold War, we just hear that there's a Cold War. We don't see the effects. And so when the history of the world is being told and histories of countries in Africa, particularly Nigeria, is being told, reference is not made to the effect of the Cold War on Africa and indeed on Nigeria. So between 1960 and 1965 was the era of the Cold War. How did this affect Nigeria? And what is it that it has to do with what was done to Nigeria? By who? Between 1960 and 1965, a lot of the nationalist movements were going on. Countries were craving and calling and pushing for independence from the Europeans. Take a note. The independence move was independence from the Europeans. But let's not forget that the Europeans have already had their powers weakened from the effects of the First and the Second World War. And from 1945, when the Second World War ended, America was the single most powerful country in the world. And they realized this because they fed off the Second World War. They stayed away, allowed Europe to weaken themselves, and they were doing business with Europe, selling them weapons, getting rich. And because they were the sole superpower in the world after the Second World War, of course, they dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. And at that time, as at 1944, 1945, they were the only ones who had nuclear power. And so they were the single judge, executioner, and judge, jury, and executioner. So they pushed, the United States of America pushed for independence. In fact, they were the ones that pushed for corporations to take over using the Bretton Woods institutions. They had a Bretton Woods meeting in 1944, 1945, and then ended up in 1946. The Bretton Woods meeting was a replication or a modification of the Berlin Conference of 1895 that was held in Germany. It was a modification of the Berlin Conference to suit the needs of the United States of America. That was what the Bretton Woods meeting was. And of course, that gave birth to the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organizations that later came from an organization that was also birthed in Germany. So we had all of this. The Cold War, the Bretton Woods institution were already in place, and the Bretton Woods institutions had started pushing what was called privatization, which was meant to transfer sovereignty of countries to corporations. So the Bretton Woods institution used the instrumentality of privatization to make their corporations more powerful than countries. And that's what the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organizations actually represented. So they set this up in the Bretton Woods meeting of 1944, 45, and 46. Now, from 1947, in fact, Nigeria was supposed to get her independence in 1958, but it was delayed because of certain things that the British didn't want in place. They saw nationalist leaders in Africa, and indeed leaders in Nigeria, that if allowed to flourish, they would see to the development of Nigeria and indeed the development of Africa. And that will make Africa and indeed Nigeria no longer dependent on them. And what Africa is suffering now is what they probably will be suffering right now if they had allowed our African leaders to flourish. So what did they do? Something happened. They started taking out all the nationalist leaders. Started taking them out across Africa, not just Nigeria. They took out Kwame Nkrumah. They took out this Togolese man, Louis, something. They took out Thomas Sankara in the 70s. They took out Lumumba in East Africa. They just started taking out anybody that had a tendency for nationalism to develop their own country. They took them out. In fact, the saving grace along those lines came the likes of them Tafawa Balewa. They were also nationalists and they were leaning towards the Soviet Union because since 1945, 1946, 1947, when the Bretton Woods institutions were created and the IMF and the World Bank started pushing for privatization, pushing for reforms across, in fact, not pushing for, they forced the reforms on Europe. They forced it in such a way that the means of production, which hitherto pre-1945, 1946, the means of productions were owned by the royal company, the royal families. The royal families, whether it is Belgium, where you have Leopold, whether it is the Britain, whether it is France, where you have King Louis, all of the means of production in Europe, the factories, they were owned by the royal families, by the monarchs, by the aristocrats. They were owned by them. And of course, because of the secret tactics of the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization that was brought about by an elite group of people in the United States, which has now become the single most powerful country, they had to cave in, and they gave into the reforms and they made laws that transferred the ownership of such factories from the monarchs to individuals that were now aligned with the interest of the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organizations. Yeah, so we had that. They pushed for privatization. And at that time, the eyes of our nationalist leaders started getting opened that, okay, fine. So if we privatize all the means of production that were owned by the Queen before that time, all the means of production will now become ours. And that was what happened. Do you know that pre-1946, 1947, in fact, pre-1960, all the minerals, it was law that all the minerals in Nigeria, all the natural resources, they belonged to the Queen. Not even to England now. They belonged to the Queen. It was a law. It was a decree. In fact, at that time, you cannot criticize the Queen without being killed. It was that serious. But after the reforms that the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organizations pushed across the world, not just in Europe now, that weaponized privatization in such a way that power was transferred from the monarchs to private individuals that were aligned to the interest of the World Bank and the IMF, right? So once that happened, that meant also that the resources, the natural resources and all the means of production that had been established in Nigeria here, that hitherto belonged to the Queen in UK, those now transferred to us. But there was a problem for the British. It meant that the leaders of Nigeria, the nationalist leaders of Nigeria, they had the power to now convert. In fact, there's a word for it, nationalize our assets, our resources, nationalize them. And they were afraid that if such countries, such nationalist leaders like them, Tafawa Balewa, Obafemi Awolowo, Kwame Nkrumah, they were vocal about it. And I think that was a mistake that they made. They were vocal about it. But right now we cannot be quiet about it because it has eaten too deep into us that what we need now is to make noise. Make noise, really. To make noise. And that's why this has to come out in the open. So, but then way back, what they did was they were vocal about it. Them Kwame Nkrumahs, the Thomas Sankaras, they were very, 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 very vocal about it. And the West was scared. Not just the West now. The British, the Europeans were scared that their assets would be nationalized like Idi Amin of Uganda was doing or did in the Uganda in East Africa, or is it Central Africa or South Africa now? So what do? They decided to start taking out our nationalist leaders. They did it across Africa. And part of the casualties was our own then Prime Minister, who was Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. They took him out in a coup that I won't call it manipulated now, they sponsored, they stage managed from behind through the help of the CIA. This information are out there in public domain. But they are just, they say that when you want to hide something from the black man, you put it in a book. I think it's so true. But they have discovered something even worse than that. And I'll talk about it in another video. So, they started taking out African leaders, taking them out. So they will instigate coups. And these coups, we need to understand this. The coups started by them saying they want to train our soldiers. So they took them, Kaduna, Eziogu, they took them, Ifeajuna, they took them for training. And that training is supposed to be, on the surface, helping them to be more prepared against foreign aggressions, blah, 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 blah. But in reality, what that training sought to do was that they were using their own programmers. I call them programmers. They're human beings, but they have been trained by the CIA to put the idea of coup into our soldiers. They filled their head with such visions and dreams of coup and gave them the training they needed to actually carry it out. And all they were simply doing was that they now needed to divide and conquer. So if a nationalist leader is not dancing to their tune, they will look down the ladder of leadership and look for somebody that they can induce with money, somebody they can brainwash and tell that, and tell certain lies to, and that person would take up such lies based on the power that they hope to get and begin to say they plan a coup and execute the coup. That was what they were doing. And that was what resulted in the death of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and others. In fact, the casualties that were involved in that 1966 coup, January 66, was not intended. Many of them were not intended. These young soldiers, not so experienced, they fell for the trap of this elite group of people in the US-led West, and then they took matters into their own hand and overdid what they were supposed to do. And after they did that, they succeeded in that, the northern people said it was an ethnic coup. And then there was a reprisal coup, right? At the end of the day, when everything died down, they had succeeded in taking out Tafawa Balewa and Ahmadu Bello and co, whom they perceived were nationalists, people who were now leaning and tilting towards the Soviet Union. Yeah. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was leaning towards the Soviet Union to help us build refineries, to help us build Ajakuta Steel, to help us build Delta Alaja Steel, because the West would not give us that technology. Until today, they would not give us that technology. They would not. So, because this group of people in the US-led West suspected that Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and co were nationalistic, along with others across Africa, they instigated coups that took all of them out almost simultaneously. Now, for Nigeria, after taking out Tafawa Balewa, whom, in my own opinion, was their main target because he was aligning with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, the Amin of Uganda, and others to form a united Africa, which they did not want. So the target was to take out Abubakar Tafawa Balewa for quote-unquote leaning towards the Soviet Union. But other casualties came because the soldiers that they instigated to carry out the coup they did beyond over-syllabus. They went and did what they did, and then, of course, they now came and painted it to the North. They were the ones that also painted it to the North that the coup was anti-North. And then the North also now engaged in reprisal attacks. Now, all that happened is history. We had one leader followed by another leader killed. That was what resulted in the death of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. And after Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, what happened? Because it was just clear confusion, you now had Aguiyi Ironsi, who was not part of the coup, but was also stationed outside Nigeria. They felt since he was trained outside Nigeria, he will be better able to handle things and also fall in line with them. And so, being the most senior soldier at that time, mantle fell on him. So there was a reprisal. Aguiyi Ironsi, who they thought would do their bidding, decided to go over syllabus too. Rather than engage democratic tenets, decided to abolish the constitution, abolish true federalism, and decided to unify Nigeria with the unitary constitution. It was Aguiyi Ironsi, coincidentally, an Igbo man, who put Nigeria into unitary government. But that's a matter for another day. Let's continue. They killed Aguiyi Ironsi in a reprisal coup, and somehow, Yakubu Gowon came up as the leader in Nigeria. In all of this, the US-led, this elite group of persons in the US-led West were no longer in control of who would be thrown up as leader in Nigeria. So at the end of the day, Yakubu Gowon came and was commander-in-chief or head of state. And before long, he also started tilting towards the Soviet Union because a lot of the things that were now built in Nigeria were being done for us by the Soviet Union. In fact, during the Civil War, there were a lot of things that came to light for Yakubu Gowon, that the church aid group was used. It's supposed to be an NGO that was supposed to be help people during the time of war, humanitarian support, but they were being used to fuel the war. And Aguiyi Ironsi saw it. People don't understand why it appeared as though Russia and US and UK were united in supporting the Nigerian government against Biafra. They didn't understand. It was a struggle. You had France on one hand, you had China on another hand, supporting the Biafrans, and you had Israel supporting both sides. Many people make a mistake of thinking that Israel supported the Biafrans. Yes, they did. They also supported the Nigerian government. And France needed the oil. In fact, at some point, they started teaching, they so convinced Ojukwu that they will help Ojukwu get secession, get Biafra, and Ojukwu would then join Cameroon to become a French colony, that they started teaching French in the Southeast at the time. French wanted Nigeria's oil. It was all about the oil for France. And it was all about geopolitics. They wanted control for Israel and for China. That was why they supported Biafra. But for Israel, which was even worse, they supported both parties. Supported Biafra and they supported the Nigerian forces. Now, the strangest one is the Soviet Union and the United States, who were having a Cold War at that time, coming out to support the Nigerian forces, which they did. But there were some things that happened during these wars that Yakubu Gowon saw and decided to lean towards the Soviet Union because they were more ready to help Nigeria develop. They wanted to make Nigeria an industrial hub, an industrialized nation within the African region. They wanted to do that. But the America And the Europeans did not want that because they saw that as a threat to their own subsistence. And because of this, they started scheming against Yakubu Gowon. And like they always would do, they will look down the ladder of leadership, look for somebody that is that can be aligned to them, manipulated with greed and all that. And then what do? They send that person, they induce that person and push that person, instigate that person to do a coup. And it was Vasta in the case of Yakubu Gowon, his close friend. In fact, Vasta was the best man at Yakubu Gowon's wedding. You can imagine that. And he used him against Yakubu Gowon and dethroned him in the name of corruption. In fact, he was lucky he was not killed. But after that, the name of Murtala Muhammad now came. Remember I told you that this time, they no longer had control of who will come up as leader in Nigeria. But whatever happened, whoever came up, they were now sending messages to them to force them to align, or they would take them out. That was what they were now doing. And they did that to Murtala Muhammad. In fact, at that time, the war had shifted. The war in the Congo was very, very serious. And the same Cold War was also beginning to affect them. That the then president of the United States of America, Gerald Ford, happened to send a message, a letter through the ambassador to Nigeria in Lagos, to the barracks. And in the letter, just outrightly warned Murtala Muhammad to conform to the interest of the United States or face the consequences. This infuriated Murtala Muhammad. And in fact, he was so angry that he was not supposed to go the next week to the extraordinary meeting of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. He was not supposed to go. But because he had already planned for his vice then, who was Olusegun Obasanjo, the trip had already been made to go and represent him at the extraordinary meeting to discuss the conflict in Congo at that time, where you had the world powers, the Soviet Union and the United States and South Africa locking horns. So he was so angry about the letter that was sent by the then US President Gerald Ford to the ambassador, or the US ambassador to Nigeria in Lagos. The letter was delivered to him in the barrack. He was so furious that he cancelled the trip. He decided to go himself instead of sending Olusegun Obasanjo to represent him. And his speech was a very bold and audacious speech at the Organization of African Unity, going against the warnings of Gerald Ford in his letter to him. And in fact, he was so angry that he published the letter, the content of the letter in the New York Times way back then, just to humiliate Gerald Ford. These are the kind of stuff that happened. And what happened? You had the Americans look down the ladder of leadership once again, and they looked for an officer, somebody they can manipulate, induce him with money, entice him with power. And at the end of the day, what happened? You had the assassination of Murtala Muhammad, just 33 days after he did what he did to Gerald Ford, the then president of the United States, using somebody in his own government. They are always doing this thing to us. They're always doing it, and we need to understand it so that we can get out of it. Now, when they finished that, they killed Murtala Muhammad, and then Obasanjo came. Obasanjo, I don't know how it happened. He needs to come out and tell Nigeria what happened, because I would have expected that somebody of the caliber of Obasanjo should have known that the assassination of Murtala Muhammad was instigated by CIA-backed soldiers to carry out the interest of the elite group of people in the US-led West. I would have expected that Obasanjo, being a vice at that time, would understand. Perhaps he did. And he got excited that he had now been promoted to the commander-in-chief and the head of states of Nigeria at that time. And guess what? He started blaming the assassination of Murtala Muhammad on Yakubu Gowon. I guess they had not finished with Yakubu Gowon because at that time, Yakubu Gowon was exiled to the UK. In fact, when he was removed in the bloodless coup that his close friend Vasta carried out, when he was removed, he was in a program in Addis Ababa. He was in an extraordinary meeting of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. And it was there that he was told, in fact, from there he had to fly back. He couldn't fly back to Nigeria. He had to first of all go to the Benin Republic, who has the president of Benin, then gave him money. He didn't have a dime. And I think that was where all this corruption of our military leaders started, because they saw that, if anything happens, I won't have anything to hold on to. He didn't have a dime. He was the president of Benin Republic that gave Gowon, I think, $10,000 to go and meet his wife, who was already in the UK at that time. So at the time when Murtala Muhammad was head of state, you already had, the wife of Gowon was already in the UK, Gowon was already in the UK, exiled there. So when Murtala Muhammad was assassinated, one would have expected that Olusegun Obasanjo would have understood the handwriting on the wall and taken the part of nationalism, like his then boss did, but he didn't. Instead of quietly just doing the biddings of the elite group of people in the US-led West, backed by the CIA, could have just done their bidding quietly and continued his journey like many other people did across Africa. He didn't. He started looking for who to pin the assassination of Murtala Muhammad on, and he didn't see anybody other than Gowon. And so he asked the UK government to repatriate Yakubu Gowon to come and face charges for his crimes of assassinating Murtala Muhammad. The UK refused. And guess what? Obasanjo became so angry, that he decided that, okay, fine, rather than allow the British to continue to exploit Nigeria, he was going to take Nigeria and hand Nigeria fully and finally to the Americans. And that was what he did. And that was why it was Obasanjo who changed our style of government from the parliamentary system of government to the American style, what do you call it now? Presidential style of government. It was Obasanjo who did it, and he did it out of anger against the British for refusing to repatriate then President Gowon to come and face charges, alleged charges of assassinating Murtala Muhammad. Something that is clear to us now, perhaps it was not clear to him then, it's clear to us now, was masterminded by this elite group of people in the US-led West. They have always been doing these things to us. And that's why this song by Bob Marley comes, its meaning is new every day. It says, how long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? And that's what they have always done to us. They've always killed our nationalist government, our nationalist leaders. They've always killed them or made them redundant. In the case of Awolowo, is to hang corruption charges on him, send him to prison, because then he was not the commander-in-chief. If he was, probably would have been killed. So he probably was saved by the fact that he was not the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Nigeria. He was not the president or the prime minister. But they saw what he did in the Southwest, in the Western region. They saw what he did, the developments that he brought about. He was a nationalist. He aligned with the likes of them Kwame Nkrumah. He aligned, and because of that, they would not let him be prime minister. He resigned, handing over to Akintola. Yes, handing over to Akintola, thinking that Akintola will carry on his legacy in the Western region, and then he will now go to change Nigeria at the federal level, the way he had changed the Western region. But the West, the elite group of people in the West, would not have that. And because he was not the prime minister, they were able to just hang corruption charges on him, send him to prison, and that was a saving grace. But he would still not get to be president of Nigeria because they wouldn't want him to replicate what he did in the Western region in the whole of Nigeria. That would mean development that would liberate Nigeria. That would mean rapid industrialization that will make Nigeria not to be dependent on the West that will make Nigeria to be self-sufficient. They didn't want that. So the leaders that they did not kill, what did they do? They actually hung corruption charges on them and took them out of the way. And that's how Olusegun Obasanjo sold Nigeria to the Americans. And it's been downhill ever since. Now, the Americans could not believe that, okay, we have somebody that can dance to a tune the way Olusegun Obasanjo did. Everything they wanted Obasanjo was doing, just like Tinubu is doing now. Operation Feed the Nation, all these things about comparative advantage. Oh, you need to grow your crops. That everything, all the rubbish that the IMF and the World Bank have taught our economics today, that have taught the likes of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Adesina, Femi Adesina, all of them was what Obasanjo was implementing. So they were excited. They liked Obasanjo. Many people don't know why it was Obasanjo they chose to come back in 1999. Because it's not because Obasanjo handed over power to the North. It's not like the power that has been in the North has benefited the North. No, it's not about the North. It's about who will ensure the status quo for them. Look at all the presidents that have been from the North. With all the time, the amount of years that the North have been in power, they are still as poor as they are. That's to tell you that it's not about the interest of the North. It's about the interest of a certain group of people, an elite group of people in the US-led West. It's about their interest. And they just look for who they can use to manipulate, who they can manipulate to align with their interest, and then that person will now be put in position to make sure the rest of Nigeria does not develop. Let's move on from Obasanjo. So Obasanjo did very well for his US-led masters. He did very well for them. Not so well for Nigeria, because Nigeria started going downhill after Obasanjo. And then he did an election, put Shehu Shagari in there. I think they thought that Shehu Shagari will also align to the interest of the US-led West. But Shehu Shagari didn't. He did a lot. Now, this is ironic. Shehu Shagari is my second best president in Nigeria, next to Umaru Musa Yar'adua. Shehu Shagari. But it's so unfortunate that the same elite group of persons in the US-led West used Muhammadu Buhari to push out Shehu Shagari in the name of corruption. You see, we need to understand something. This elite group of people that started this whole Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, World Trade Organizations, they know how to destabilize a country. And that's exactly what they did in 1983. They know how to destabilize a country, particularly when you are dependent on them. That is why it is crucial for Nigeria to be self-sufficient. China is self-sufficient. Russia is self-sufficient. Countries that are able to have their own foreign policy and even control their own internal policy, domestic policy. Those countries are self-sufficient countries. But the IMF and the World Bank, they love it. And so they destroy the self-sufficiency, particularly starting with the food self-sufficiency. Then you go to the manufacturing self-sufficiency of countries. They destroy it. They don't want it. And so they instigated all the chaos, calling corruption, saying that the government or the administration of Shehu Shagari was corrupt. The administration of Shehu Shagari achieved the most in the history of leaders or presidents of Nigeria. All the ports, most of the refineries, the Ajaokuta steel, all of those things were initiated. Many of them finished. Bridges and all the stuff that you had in Lagos then were made and built by Shehu Shagari. But somehow, because he was no longer dancing to the tune, and let me state here that a lot of these things were built for us by the Soviet Union, by Russia. Ajaokuta steel, Russia. Most of the refineries were the only ones that were built by the West, not by the West now, by the British, were the ones that were built when America has not succeeded in weaponizing privatization to take over sovereignties of countries. Then the British Petroleum was a royal company. It was owned by the the Queen of England, by the Crown. In fact, at that time, the law was that every resources in Nigeria belonged to the Crown. So, but after this elite group of people in the US-led West succeeded in using their Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, to weaponize privatization starting with the Europeans, what happened was that they would not allow Nigeria to build new refineries anymore. And so Gowon started going to the Soviet Union. They took him out. The Murtala Muhammed started going to the Soviet Union. They took him out. Shehu Shagari started going to the Soviet Union. They took him out. In fact, when Buhari became head of state, of course, from the stories that we have, he didn't plan the coup. But like I told you earlier, the coup now got out of their control to the extent that they could not determine who would succeed after a coup. And so Buhari's name came up and Idi Agbon followed. And the IMF, through their usual aids and loans scheme, which they use to corrupt governments and to destroy a country's self-sufficiency, through that program, they wanted the Buhari administration to take a loan, IMF loan, with conditions that will destroy the food self-sufficiency and manufacturing self-sufficiency of Nigeria. And Idi Agbon, who seemed to be in charge at the time, refused. And guess what? They took him out and took out the administration of Buhari, his first coming. Through who? Babangida. It is interesting to note that all the coup that took place from 1966 to 1990 were done by the same set of military officers trained by the US. And of course, in such training, I told you it's not just ordinary training. They train them and they fill their heads with all sorts of things. They induce them, they appeal to their sense of greed, and those ones who cave in. And so that was what happened. The same group of people have been planning the coup. In fact, the coup that brought Buhari in was organized by the same group, but Buhari was the beneficiary. The same thing, the coup that brought in Murtala Muhammad, he didn't know anything about it, but he was the beneficiary. The assassination of Murtala Muhammad, Obasanjo didn't know anything about it, or perhaps he did, I don't know. But he was the beneficiary. The one that took out Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, he didn't know anything about it, but he was the beneficiary, talking about Aguiyi and Ironsi. So he was the beneficiary. The first time that you had somebody who was actively involved in the coup, benefiting from the coup, started with Babangida and then followed by Abacha. That was the first time you had people who were actively involved in planning these coups, benefiting from the coup. And guess what? Babangida started dancing to the tune of the IMF and World Bank, and the programs that were started, Alaja Steel, Ajakuta Steel, refineries that were started by the administration of Yakubu Gowon, followed by Shehu Shagari, they stopped them because those projects were projects that were being done by the Soviet Union. They were all stopped. And they started dancing to the tune of the IMF. They wanted us to do structural adjustment program. Babangida gave them structural adjustment program. They wanted devaluation of the Naira. Babangida gave them devaluation of the Naira. They wanted projects to stop, developmental project. He gave it to them. In fact, institutionalized corruption, took corruption to a new level. Not to the level it is today now, but it took it to a new level by then standard, by the standards of 1985. Took it to a new level. And poverty started increasing, hunger, corruption, took all of this to a new level. And then people started getting agitated. It was a confusing situation for Babangida and the US-led West, because it got to a point people started talking, and that's why we must make noise now. The noise became too much because the suffering that the Babangida administration brought was too hard for people to bear. So people started talking. They were talking. And because the talk now became so hard for the Bretton Woods institution to handle, They wanted another person that would come in and dance to their tune. So they went to bring Ernest Shonekan, who studied in UK. They thought he would dance to their tune. And they didn't know that Abacha had his own agenda. So Abacha came in, and Abacha knew all these things because he was all along part of those people who were planning the coup. And so he went opposite direction. Opposite direction. I think one mistake I would say that Abacha made was not aligning fully with Russia. Probably would have given him protection, like Russia is giving Saad of Syria protection right now against the US. If not for him, they would have taken out Assad. I guess the same mistake Muammar Gaddafi made, not aligning fully with Russia, who probably would have defended him. I don't know. So they have always done this thing to us. Our leaders who have the capacity to be nationalistic, they take them out or they hang something on their head, put them in prison and get them out of the way. And how did they do it? They look down the ladder, look for other Nigerians, fellow Nigerians like you and I, who are willing to serve their greed, to feed their greed and grab power. They will do anything to get power. So they usually will meet such persons, and such persons will now be made to, how do I describe it? Betray Nigeria, betray their leaders and take power, dance to the tune of the West. And when they don't dance to the tune, they will destabilize the country and on and on and on like that. That was what happened until Buhari came. In fact, Buhari was not even supposed to be president because based on his antecedents, they did not want to take chances with Buhari. And that's why you saw that what they did was they started going to dance and appease the gods of the US-led West. Appeased him, appointed Obama's campaign company as their own campaign company. It was all propaganda. It was all lobbying, telling them that we will dance to your tune, we will dance to you, we'll do what you want. Buhari thought he could outsmart them. And so he got into power, immediately was sworn in, he made that famous speech, I belong to everybody, I belong to nobody. And what's this man saying? This group of elites, this elite group of people in the US-led was like, this is not what we said. No. You can't belong to everybody and belong to nobody. You belong to us. You have to do our bidding. And he refused. Remember that the same thing they did to Jonathan. He would not allow them to have their way with their gay and LGBT agenda. So they took him out. Remember? They took him out. And so this was going to happen again with Buhari. First of all, it was, how do you have a president, and a president is rumored to be poisoned in his own presidential villa? If not with the support of these enemies of Nigeria, if not with their support, how is that even possible? But the news we have was that was what happened. He was poisoned and he had to spend 3 months outside of Nigeria in the UK to be treated. His saving grace was that he probably actually decided to make a U-turn. If not, his own case would have been like that of Yar'adua. You see, I think it is my opinion now that Obasanjo was probably not courageous enough. He had danced to the tune of this elite group of people in the US-led West in his first coming, so much that in his second coming, he didn't want to offend them. He tried it and they used his vice president against him, Atiku. And so when he was able to get his, gain his ground and find his stability, he decided to, okay, fine, let me bring in somebody that will be able to do what I could not do. And he looked around and saw somebody like Yar'adua, who from his character was incorrigible. He suspected that Yar'adua would be able to do the things that he could not do. All the privatization that he did, he knew, I suspect that he knew that Yar'adua would reverse them. He knew. And that was why when Yar'adua came, the privatization of Ajakuta Steel, Alaja Steel, he reversed them. NEPA, refineries. In fact, Otedola and Dangote, who are, in my opinion, stooges to this elite group of people in the US-led West, had bought Port Harcourt refineries, Kaduna refineries, and Warri refineries. But Yar'adua came and changed all that. I guess Obasanjo was not courageous enough. Yes, that's my opinion. And so he thought that he could do one good thing while living, and that's to give us Yar'adua. And Yar'adua is the best president in Nigeria's history. I'm a Southerner, I'm a Christian, but tribe aside, religion aside, Yar'adua is the best president Nigeria ever had. And he was nationalistic, and he was leaning towards Russia. And because of that, he took him out. Many people think, oh, he was sick, he was sickly. Yar'adua was taken out because he was undoing everything that was in the interest of this elite group of people in the US-led West. He was undoing them. And so they were dealing with him. He didn't know. These people, they are wicked. Look at how Abacha was taken out. Rumors have it that it was this Palestinian leader. Yes, is it Yasser Arafat? Yes, I think so. Rumors have it that it was when Arafat came to visit him that he probably put some biological weapons in his handshake. And it was after that handshake that he could not get himself anymore. And before he knew it, he died. And of course, they gave all this story about the apple some girls gave to him. That's a lie. I believe that it was the biological weapons thing, that he probably used somebody that he trusted. And that's how they always worked. Maybe the Palestinian leader knew, maybe he didn't know, but somehow they were able to manage to do it. They shook hands with Abacha, and that was why he died. Similar things happened even to MKO Abiola too. A lot of these things happened. Many people think that it is because of internal fightings. No, it is the manipulations of the external forces that would not want Nigeria to develop, because they fear that if Nigeria is developed, then it is a problem for them. And truly it will be, because it will be a level playing field. All the enjoyment that they're enjoying there today will be enjoying them here. It will be a level playing field. They don't want to pay for the resources they are getting, the fair price. So they will use corruption. They created corruption. And it continues. So they took out Yar'adua. In fact, the way they took him out was so systemic. Just like they took Abacha out, you would want to put it on Yar'adua's sickness. Yar'adua was sick, yes, but the sickness was treatable. Look at, they treated Buhari, didn't they, after he agreed to change ways? In fact, when he refused and decided to start going towards China, like Tinubu was doing at a later point, did they not instigate the NSAS? They instigated it. This NSAS protest it got the buy-in. I would not say it was started. It was not started. They saw it. This elite group of persons in the US-led West, they saw it as an opportunity and they bought into it. So they brought in they have financial muscles. Forget it. This country, there are people you see as your neighbor. They are working with the IMF and the World Bank. They are working with this elite group of people in the US-led West. They are traitors amongst us who care only about the big cars that they want to drive. They want to drive the latest cars. And so they would sell their brother and sister to just get the car, not minding that a whole country is destroyed in the process. There are so many people like that. And so they would use such people to betray these ones, take them out. And that was what they did with Yar'adua. He was getting sick. And he was making the mistake of going to the people who were responsible for his sickness for treatment. And so his sickness kept getting worse. And he realized it too late. When he realized it, that was when he now decided that he would not go to Germany for treatment anymore. He would go to Saudi Arabia. But at that point, it was already too late. Because the people who were doing him were the people he was running to for treatment. And they finished him. They took him out. Because he was going to... Oh my God. The Uwais report that we're talking about was done during Yar'adua. If Yar'adua has implemented the Uwais report, we will not be talking about this nonsense that is going on under Mahmoud's INEC. We won't be talking about the nonsense that is going on under this so-called tribunal with the rubbish judgment that he gave. Judgment without justice. We won't be talking about it. So they didn't want that development to come. And so they took out Yar'adua. They have always done this to us. We need to understand this. It is crucial that we understood this. And that's why I am taking my time to explain this. I beg you, please, if you're still watching, I appreciate you. Thank you. But we need to come together. We need to make noise. This is the only safety net. This is the only safeguard we have at this time. They have weaponized poverty. They have weaponized ignorance to so much that it will only take our collective making so much noise to free Nigeria. No single individual can. No single individual can. It is for this same reason that they will not allow somebody like Peter Obi to be president of Nigeria, because he will do to Nigeria what an Obafemi Awolowo would have done. The whole arrangement that was made to bring Buhari in was, we all know how he came. It was Tinubu that brokered it. He took them, the APC, to America. They said they were appointing the Obamas and all that. A lot of things went on behind the scene, and he was able to push, not in my own words, now he's the one that said it, he was able to push Buhari on Nigeria. And after what Buhari did, Buhari wanted to start getting some sense, and doing some good things, and then they would not allow him. They would not. Remember when they wanted to do currency swap, when they said we didn't need to spend dollar for things that were coming in from China? Remember, that was in 2018, 2019, 2020. That was when that agreement was in place. I saw the elite group of persons in the US-led West went to work again and said, oh, if this is allowed to happen, that means that it will be the weakening of the dollar. It will be the strengthening of Nigeria's naira. It will be a push in the direction of rapid industrialization, alleviation of poverty, creation of millions of jobs. I'm talking millions of jobs. Maybe they spent trillions on Dangote's refinery and they said to give us 100,000 jobs. They spent trillions on the Blue Rail. They spent trillions on Lekki Deep Seaport. They said to give us 100,000 jobs. In all, 300,000 after selling Nigeria to Nigeria's enemies. Now, what we need in Nigeria is minimum of 50 million jobs. This cannot come from this white elephant Trojan projects that these people are doing. They knew it. And so, in order to stop this move by Buhari, they looked for things that they can use. One of it was the NSAS. The NSAS started, they hooked into it. And when Buhari stopped his project, they stopped the NSAS. They know how to destabilize a country. They know how to destabilize a country. So many of the things you heard, they own the media. They own the media. When did Nduka Obaigbenna get money to set up Arise News? Where did John Momo get money to set up channels? It is humongous money that's required. And if you look behind the curtains, you'll find out that, in fact, Nduka Obaigbenna, the owner of Arise, the chairman of Arise News, let me not say owner because they are just front persons. He was working with NTA before. Is it Federal Radio Corporation of Nigeria? Working with the government. Where did he get the money? And then come and explain to us. You'll find out that the so-called investors that are subsidiaries of companies that are linked to the International Financing Corporation, which is the IFC, which is an arm of the IMF and the World Bank. And then you have organizations like the International Investor Bank, right? IBDG, and you have groups like BlackRock, ESG, and the likes, who behind the scenes are pulling the string. They are the ones that are controlling the world. They are controlling the world. So you have the likes of those people who now came to avert and tell Buhari then that, come, look, these people, they will remove you. Buhari kept saying that the NSAS is about removing him. We didn't know what was going on. But behind the scene, there was, the NSAS was a culmination. It was a melting pot of so many things. There were people who were truly agitating for the NSAS in the NSAS project. There were people, the IPOB people also seized the opportunity of the NSAS. I hope you know. IPOB infiltrated. These people that were backed by the IMF and the World Bank, they also infiltrated. So many people took advantage, they seized the opportunity of the NSAS to do different things. So Buhari kept talking about, the NSAS is to remove me. So we did not understand what was happening because there was an arm or a group of persons in the NSAS protest that was being backed by this elite group of persons in the US-led West that are behind the IMF and the World Bank, who were the ones sponsoring people. Money was coming out to buy food. Where was the money coming out from? Ask yourself, why is it that we have not been able to get that kind of protest again? Because the leaders that they are forced on us now are leaders that are dancing to their tune. If Tinubu refuses to dance to their tune now, you will be shocked. The same people that are shouting, Tinubu is nice today, they will come back and shout Tinubu is a monster. But because many of them are on the payroll of these IMF and the World Bank, they are keeping quiet now because Tinubu is doing their bidding. How do I know Tinubu is doing their bidding? Everything they have always asked for, devaluation of the naira, everything they have always asked for, privatization in the name of Electricity Act, the new Electricity Act that is signed into law, the Student Loan Act, the tax reforms, everything they wanted, devaluation of the naira, he has given to them. Destruction. You see, shit. We need to wake up. The only safeguard we have now is to make noise. We need to rally around each other, come round. This is not about Labour Party or APC. There are victims everywhere. In fact, APC has more victims. Look at the meeting that was arranged in Aso Rock Villa, where Wike brought traditional rulers from Rivers State. Was Amechi there? He was not. Amechi is an APC member. Is he not a victim? He's a victim. And that's a high-ranking victim. And there are low-ranking victims. I have friends who used to shout, APC, shout Tinubu. The policies of Tinubu now has rendered them handicapped. So there are victims across the political parties. This is not the time for us to shout political parties anymore. This is the time for us to come together as oppressed against the oppressor. This is that time. And we need to come together and make noise. There's a lot of enlightenment that needs to go on. And we need your support. In whatever way you can, do it. But noise we must make, really.